Hello everybody and welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me. My name is Deborah Hatswell and you're listening to BBR Investigations. Last week I shared an interview with you all where I was chatting with a chap called Michael, who on many of his urban explorations has encountered paranormal activity around the northwest of England and also in the area where I used to live and directly behind my old home. Now, I have an update on this topic as earlier this week, my husband had a chat with his friend who was visiting our new home. During the chat, they were discussing the paranormal work that myself and my husband do, and his friend Chris shared a couple of his experiences with us, and he was happy for me to take the conversation. Now, it is only a short interview, but I am honestly grateful that we had the forethought to tape what was said. I'm really grateful to Chris for sharing his experiences with us and allowing me to share them with you. Where we live, it's quite a small community. Everybody knows everybody, and most of us are related to several families in the town. So sharing the strange reports of paranormal and supernatural activity that happens to the people here is an honour for me. Speaking for myself and my husband Mark, coming from a past of not really sharing with our friends and family members what we do, we had no idea how freeing it is to just have a chat in my own home, and it's considered completely okay. An ordinary conversation about an extraordinary experience or three. After Mark's chat with Chris, I will share an encounter in the same area that happened to my family member Nat when he was a child. Nat's my mother's cousin and comes from my European Germanic Basque background down the maternal line. A line rich in experiences, mediums and knowers. And then we can look at some of the new cases that have come in since I last updated you guys, including a strange figure seen at Rivington Pike that may be the ghost of a grisly murder victim. And then to end, I will share with you probably the scariest story I've ever been told. And it was shared with me by the witness herself. She's from Stockholm and it happened in the early 2000s. So settle back, get comfortable, and let's begin. Chris. I was walking with a few friends around the Chinese gardens at Rivington not that long ago when something weird happened. I was with my friend Julie and Jay. Myself and Julie were smoking, so we walked a little bit ahead. Jay had on a bright red jumper. He was behind us, quite easy to spot. As we went down the stairs that have those little arches, I saw Jay in my peripheral vision, and Julie did too. So we moved apart so he could come down behind us. But when we turned, he wasn't there, and he was still quite far back behind us. When he finally came around the corner into sight, it really blew my mind, because he'd been there with us. Somehow, he was there with me and Julie. I said, "No way, you've already been here." Not only could we see him clearly, we also felt him behind us. It was as if he was coming to walk between us. That's why we stepped apart. So to know he was not near us at that point was mind-blowing. I don't know how to explain that. It felt hanging, really creepy, freaked me out. Now, the old gardens grounds that Chris and his friends were walking in, no longer tended. When you're in there, it's like stepping back in time. It's where the bear man was seen in the 1990s. Now, there are lots of reports that I've shared with you from this area before, but there are still some within families out there I just never shared, and I would love to hear all of them. I did find some information on the gardens from a scout around on the web, and it said Rivington Castle has been the home to several ghosts over the decades. In the terrace gardens particularly, apparitions have been seen by workmen at the site and by some council workers who arrived early one morning, although there is no clear description of what they saw.
So what happened again?
We went upriver, went to them Chinese gardens, and we were reaching down, me and Julie having a smoke, and we was walking down. We walked down them little weird stairs that's got all the little arches on it, and Jay, Julie's husband, had a red jumper on. So me and Julie's walking down having a smoke and that, and I caught him in the peripheral vision. Julie's seen the same thing, so she's moved out of the way. I've moved out of the way because we knew Jay was coming down. When we turned around, Jay wasn't even stood there. And the next thing, he come walking around the corner and was like, what the fuck? The creep was like, yeah, you just been here, like, oh, he's hanging goosebumps all over, and that was gross.
Did you have the feeling of him coming up behind you as well?
You could see it, dead clear. Could see it, dead clear. Turn around like for him to move out of the way. Like, man, he wasn't even there. Weird, proper weird.
Crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, he's angry with that. It's a creeper. Proper fucking freaky up there, isn't it?
Mark asked Chris if this was his only experience with the paranormal, and he shared an experience that happened to his friend Julie when he visited a churchyard in Winsford in Cheshire. Sadly, at the time of the interview, Chris is not aware of the name of the cemetery. That's something I can update you on, hopefully. Chris said, one of the men who lives where we do, Trotter, has a job digging graves in the cemetery, and Julie went with him one day. And when they were there, Julie could hear bells ringing continuously, and as she went to ask him if he could hear them too, a nun come from the rectory and did something strange. As she handed Julie and the man digging a card, she said, if you have any weird things happen in your home tonight, you need to ring this number. Of course, that completely freaked Julie out. She couldn't wait to leave, but she did ask the nun why were all the bells ringing. And the nun explained the sound she could hear were grave bells. In olden times, many people were buried alive, so bells with a string were fitted inside the grave, and a watchman would listen out for the sound of the bell so he could hurriedly dig up the site and rescue you. The nun also explained that the churchyard had many ghosts, and it was they who were ringing the bells. As Julie walked away feeling scared, something pushed her hard, making her fall over, and she was literally screaming in fright.
And that churchyard is in Winsford. Trotter, you know, on Kenyon Way, he digs graves there. And when he was digging it, the nun had come out and she said to Julie, because Julie went down with him on the day, she kept on hearing bells ringing and she's like, what the fuck's all these bells ringing? And then the nun come out of the house, she's come out and she's like, if anything weird happens in your house tonight, you need to ring this number and give him a little card. That's freaked Julie out. Julie said to him, what are these bells that I keep hearing? She went, in the olden days, people used to get buried alive, so they used to get buried with bells. She went, it's a very haunted graveyard. I started saying all this weird shit. Julie went for a walk around and something went like that, wham, and pushed her right over. Got up screaming.
Honestly, at this point, I don't know who to be more concerned about. Julie, who's clearly had an awful experience, or the poor guy who's got to go back the next day and dig another grave. At the beginning of our podcast, I said I would share with you a report sent to me by my cousin Nat, who lived on the same road as the gravedigger. He experienced a lifetime of paranormal activity at the family home in Little Hulton, a short walk from my old house. Also, a short walk from where the strange creature was seen last year in Cutacre, over Hulton. Cutacre houses a sealed ROC bunker, which is directly on point with the transmission station at Winter Hill. Nat said, you know, Deb, I remember when I was about 11, the same age as your grandson Zane. I was playing out with my mates one night. We realised that the sky was really starry. We all noticed it. So there I am looking up, and I saw a pair of lights moving across the sky. I assumed at that age they were the wingtip lights on a plane, until one merged with the star, and the other went off at right angles. I remember thinking, what's big enough to merge with the star? Where I live now, Deb, we've got big sky. If I'm looking south, we've got uninterrupted views of Cannock Chase and beyond. And to the west, we have a golf course and then fields. The skies are clear here, so I'm always looking in case I see anything. But it can get confusing at times. We have air traffic out of Liverpool and Manchester. We've lived here for 52 years now, and when we first moved in, I was chatting with a neighbour, and he told me that his neighbour used to get up very early to take his wife to work. One morning, he pulled back the curtains, and there was a UFO out there, and it had landed on the golf course. Of course, he watched gobsmacked for about 10 minutes. Then he realised he should have taken a photograph, so he ran in the house to get his camera. but by the time he got back to the window, it had gone. All this happened about 2 years before we moved in, so around 1970. I remember it clearly, Deb, because it was also sighted by 2 coppers in Lee as it flew over their beat, and it made it into the papers. I went and asked him about what had happened that morning, but he wouldn't say anything. I'm told he reported it to the local UFO Society, so I'm always looking at the sky, Deb. I have a feeling now Nat will have a few more experiences to share with me, because that's not the first he's shared. For a girl who walked this road alone, it is so empowering to know that I'm just one of many. I remember in 1994, one of my good friends, Freddie, told me that one night the whole field lit up where we lived, and there were lights that came together and then shot off to Winter Hill. And lots of people were out watching the lights, and that made it into the papers too. And that's before I explain why some of our streets are named Witch Eaves, Witchbrook, and the Grey Lady Close. I had a look through my reports for anything that came from around the terrace gardens or the churchyard that Chris spoke of, and I did find a couple of Winter Hill reports that you'll hear for the first time. One of my listeners on YouTube contacted me about a strange figure he saw at the Winter Hill transmission station. Simon Linford said, I work around the Bolton area and I was delivering around Horwich one Saturday morning, about 7:30am, 8am-ish. I was looking up at the mast, just a quick glance, and something strange caught my attention. I'm sure I saw a big black figure standing there. I did a double take and it was gone. It's beautiful down there, but strange. Now, did Simon see the Winter Hill beast that many people speak of? Or was it the ghost of George Henderson? At a distance of 700 yards from the telephone mast, there's a site known locally as Scotsman's Stump, and there's a very simple memorial, and it's erected to mark the spot where George Henderson was discovered in 1838. George wasn't from the area, he was from Annan in Dumfriesshire, and it happened on the 9th of November 1838. He was only 20 when it did happen. George was employed by a draper, John Street, Blackburn, and it is said the motive for the crime was theft, as George was known to have £15 in his possession. He had stayed overnight at the Cock Tavern, Blackrod, with a friend, Thomas Rutterforth, who was in the same business as George, and he left at 8am the following morning. When his body was found, his trouser pockets were inside out and torn, and only £1 11 was recovered from the left side pocket. George was to meet a friend and fellow countryman Benjamin Burrell for dinner at Belmont. Near the top of the hill were a group of houses known as Five Houses. They've long gone now. In one of them, William Garbutt kept a beer house, and he also owned a coal pit some distance away en route to Belmont. The dying man was found in the ditch at the side of the track, half a mile northeast of the Five Houses, by a 14-year-old boy named Thomas. He was returning from the coal pit. He heard moans coming from the ditch, and he saw the blood on the ground. He ran back to the coal pit to summon help, and the man was carried to the beer house at Five Houses where he died. The local constable collected evidence, and the local surgeon carried out the post-mortem and recovered lead shot from George's head. James Whittle, who had been seen shooting on the moor at the time, was promptly arrested, and he admitted shooting in the area with a borrowed gun. And when the remaining cartridges were checked, the pellet charge matched those taken from George's body. The inquest was held and lasted 2 days, during which 22 witnesses were called. At a later assize, the jury returned a verdict of wilful murder against James Whittle, and he was taken to Kirkdale Prison. When the assize trials ended, the verdict was not guilty, and Whittle was promptly discharged. Little is known of Mr. Whittle and what happened after the trial. It is said that he became blind, he shunned company, and he died in middle age. I wonder if George still walks his path to work each day, still carrying on what he did in life, or has he gone home to his beloved Scotland? I hope it's the latter. Another area our witness Chris mentioned was Winsford in Cheshire, a place well known for dog-like shucks and canines that walk upright on two legs. I took a report a long time ago now from a lad named David, who saw just such a creature climb the walls of a local pub. The pub is just a few steps away from the River Weaver, and not far from what I suspect is the churchyard that Chris was describing. When I spoke with David, he said, "I've had some events in life that are what some would term unexplained, but things really ramped up for me in 2016 when I had an encounter with an upright bipedal canine. I don't know what else to call it. I used to come home from work really late and I had no transport of my own and nothing was running then. So my only choice was to walk home, and I did that every night. One night, as I walked close to one of the local pubs, I saw this creature, and it was climbing up the walls, and it pulled itself onto the roof of the building. I don't know what it was. It was absolutely massive. It took about 3 seconds to move up that wall, and it did so naturally. Its movements were fluid. The next experience happened after moving to a farm. That's roughly when I began to get really sick with stomach and breathing problems. Doctors couldn't explain what was happening. I felt so ill it made me feel like I couldn't breathe. I'd just walk at night. I think maybe now that when I was out at night or sitting near that river out there on my own, I think that's how I started attracting the attention of this creature. I've heard them called many names, but for now I'm going to call it a dogman." Davy went on to add, "I started to feel sicker and sicker all of the time. I felt like I needed to be outside in the fresh air to get my breath back. I was suffering so much indoors, even when I sensed they were lurking out there, I'd still go. I would say they definitely use the canal and the river and the train tracks as routes. I think they can use them when they're passing through Winsford and other areas." Now, many of you will wonder how on earth a cryptid creature could be living under our noses in a semi-rural town. But you'd be surprised to know the area between Crewe, Cheshire and Ellesmere Port has a number of dogman creature sightings, as David called them. Even Risley Prison has a tale from a van driver who saw it cross the road about 3 a.m. in January 2018. Let's leave the northwest behind and head to the Midlands, an area my listeners know well, for it holds the dubious title, a British paranormal hotspot. It can also be seen from our Nat's house. Cannock Chase. These days, many of the reports I get coming through YouTube. One such case was shared with me just this week, and it came from one of my listeners. Obviously, when you're on YouTube, you have a handle, and our witness's handle is Dodge the Badger. Dodge said, "I live in Kings Norton, Birmingham, and back in 2005, I had a really weird experience. One day I was cycling along the old Roman road late at night, and I heard a very deep, demonic growl coming from the woods. It happened as I passed them. I pedalled for my life, and I was as near the end of the road about half a mile away. I believed that the growl had followed me, but it kept itself hidden, as the growl was coming from the opposite side of the road that it came from originally. Wonder if he realised there might have been two." He went on to add, "I've never been back there and I never will. It scared me so much for the first time, but hearing it for the second time made me realise it really did feel evil. The whole event was traumatic, and I did suffer from alopecia from that incident. And obviously I didn't tell anyone, as they would think I was mad. You're the first person I've told this, Deb, and it feels good to finally do so. So keep up the good work that you do." I wonder if, as he says, it moved so quickly or in such a way that it was on one side of the road originally and the other side of the road the next time. But let's theoretically think, like, what if there was more than one of them? I'll leave that hanging there. Well, I'll let Dodge know that he's not the only one to have an experience in Kings Norton, because I found one not too far away of a wolf-headed man. It's not a report that came into me at BBR. I just researched the area online and I found the story in a blog called the Top Secret blog. It was called "A Man with an Alsatians Head." The sighting happened about 20 years back in Kings Norton. The witness's name was Dave. He was about 20 years old when it all happened. Very similar to our witness in Winsford. Dave was coming home from a night out with friends in Birmingham city centre. And although he'd been drinking, he stressed he'd not drunk and he had a clear head. He got off the night service bus at Kings Norton Green and he decided to cut through a large playing field which sits opposite the cemetery at the green and takes you to a canal at the bottom, which for Dave would have cut about half an hour off his walk home. It was a clear night with the moon providing a fair amount of light, but it was really cold. As Dave started to walk along the path which runs along the edge of the canal, he felt something strange, and after about a quarter of the length he glanced to his left and he saw a very tall man walking parallel with him across the other side of the field. And he guessed that the guy was about 7 to 8 feet tall, which really caught his attention and made him look more carefully. He said while still walking, he noticed to his surprise that the guy had what appeared to be the head of an Alsatian dog. At first, he thought maybe it was a mask of some sort, but as he looked, he could see the creature's breath coming from its snout, and there seemed to be a fluid movement as it walked. Not the stiff neck you'd expect from a mask placed over a man's head. This creature was wearing a long, dark coat, never looked in Dave's direction. Dave panicked a little bit at that point, understandably, and decided to speed up his pace, which he did. He glanced across to his left and was alarmed to see the creature was matching his pace. Instead of crossing the brook that runs along the base of the field leading to the canal, he cut right up the small road. And just before he reached the road, he broke into a sprint, and he looked fully at the creature to see what it would do. It kept pace with him the whole time, but it didn't appear to be running. It was just maintaining its course. It stepped over the brook like you would a small puddle, at which time Dave had to turn his back, making a sprint to the main road. That must have been awful. He said that was the worst part, imagining this thing was right at the back of him. As he reached the main road, there was a fair bit of traffic, and that helped, and he turned to see if this thing had followed him, and thankfully it was nowhere to be seen. So, was the wolf-headed man or his kind responsible for the growl heard by Dodge not too far away? I don't know, but I do believe these creatures are showing themselves on purpose. In all of the events, the creature could have remained hidden for a short amount of time, yet it was out in open for all to see. Almost like a, you matter not a jot to me, you insignificant human. Now let's move to an area some of my paternal ancestors are from, while I share what I believe is one of the scariest stories that's come into BBR. Our witness Pearl shared the experiences with me via email, and I am eternally grateful that she did. Pearl said, "Here's an account of what I experienced in a suburb of Stockholm while working as a care assistant in the early 2000s. I'd been sent to look after an elderly man who I will refer to as John. During the day, there were always 2 carers with him in his large ground floor flat. Upon arriving, my colleague introduced herself and John. While having a coffee and chatting, my colleague, who I will refer to as Anna, gave me some background about John's medical conditions. He was confined to a wheelchair and his movements were very limited. He was unable to stand or bear any weight on his legs at all." Remembering that sentence, as it is highly likely to come up again in this account. John's speech had been affected by one of his conditions, but he did a good job in helping us understand what his needs were. It was a warm summer day, and John wanted to go out for a walk. I was so pleased about that, as I felt a sense of not being welcome in that flat, a feeling which didn't come from John or Anna in any way, just the flat itself. Plus, it was really chilly in one corner of the living room when the rest of the flat was warm. During the next few days, I was sent to John to learn how to look after him. Each day, I felt as if something didn't want me there. The cold corner of the living room didn't warm up either. There were loads of tiny holes in the wall in this cold corner. I asked why, and Anna told me that they had tried many times to hang a picture there, but it never stayed up. They would get the right hook for it to be because it was a concrete wall, but it always fell out and the picture ended up on the desk underneath. I thought it was weird, said Pearl, but I didn't think it was anything paranormal. I didn't join up the dots then. That happened much later. After a couple of weeks, my boss told me I had to work nights. The holiday season had begun and there was just no choice. I didn't want to be there at night. In fact, I didn't want to be there at all, as the feeling I wasn't wanted had grown much stronger. Added to that, I felt I was being watched, scrutinised sometimes. My skin felt prickly and sometimes I felt nausea. I felt very tired. It was like I was drained of energy and it was got you when you was at your worst. I started to wonder if the flat was haunted. The first night shift was absolutely ghastly. The telephone would ring, but the phone number would show either a row of dashes or just random numbers, not a telephone number. And it rang time and time again throughout the night. As I walked into the living room from the kitchen, I saw a dark grey, transparent cloud move from the cold corner across the wall, and part of it dissolved into the front door and the wall. The whole of the living room was freezing. I could actually see my breath. This was a summer night. There was no doubt in my mind now that these things were connected to the paranormal. Before going to bed, though, I was too scared to sleep. I made a sandwich and a cup of tea. I sat at the kitchen table, prolonged it. I was still cold. The feeling that I was being watched came again, and whatever was watching me was standing very close. I kept saying the Lord's Prayer and I tried to stay calm. There was a small pot plant standing on a long rectangular cloth in the middle of the table. I felt the soil to see if it needed watering, and it did. What happened next scared the absolute shit out of me. I got up from the table to put my cup and my plate in the dishwasher and fill the watering can. When I turned around, the pot plant had moved to the end of the table closest to me. It moved by itself. It was literally millimetres from falling off the edge. I knew I hadn't moved it. One more millimetre and it would fall off the table. Although I didn't hear any laughter, I sensed something was laughing at me, mocking me even. And after watering the plant, I went to check on John. And thankfully he was sound asleep. Over the following weeks, I worked nights there a number of times. And the telephone would ring, but nobody was there. The grey cloud would sometimes appear and dissolve into the front door. I could never sleep, so I just stayed up and watched TV. And the channel would suddenly change. The cold corner was still cold, and sometimes the rest of the living room would feel unseasonably cold. Sometimes I would hear a kitchen cupboard bang shut, but there was nobody ever there. The cold water tap in the kitchen would be turned on and left running. The freezer door would be opened and just left open. I asked tentatively if my colleagues could get any sleep when they were there, and they said yeah. I asked my boss if I could change and work nights somewhere else, but she was having none of that. Of course, I couldn't tell her why. She wasn't particularly pleasant at the time, so I realised I'd just going to have to put up with it. I dreaded being alone there. I'd ring my boyfriend and talk to him for comfort. He was a spiritual and calm man. He believed there was something malevolent there. One night I called him during the early hours of the morning. I was crying and shaking, and this is what happened. John called out and I went to see what he wanted. And to my shock, he was sitting on the end of his bed with his legs dangling over. That was physically impossible for John to do by himself. I said, what the I don't know who was the most gobsmacked, me or John. He told me he didn't know how he got there. He woke up sitting there. He was frightened and his skin was very cold to the touch. The bedroom was freezing. And with the help of the ceiling lift, I got John back into bed. I made him a hot drink, and again I asked him how he managed to get out of bed and sit at the end. And as I said, that was physically impossible for him. Honestly, I believe he did that by himself. John was frightened by something, and he couldn't say what it was. On one of my days off, another boss called me and asked if I could work a day shift instead. I was going to take the place of a colleague who had a hospital appointment that day, and he would work my night shift instead. I was so relieved. This, I believe, was meant to be. The colleague I worked with that day, I'll call her Jane, had also worked nights there. We hit it off straight away, and during the day she tentatively asked me if I'd experienced anything strange there. She was obviously had, and I asked her to explain. Jane had experienced basically the same things, including finding John sitting at the foot of the bed with his legs dangling over. It was a relief for both of us to be able to talk about it. Thankfully, my last night shift there was fast approaching. However, the phenomenon had one more treat in store for me. On this particular night, I'd gone to check on John, who was sleeping like a baby. I went from his bedroom, through the hallway and into the living room on my way to the kitchen. Suddenly, something stopped me in my tracks. Literally. I was suddenly standing in front of what perhaps could have been a portal. I don't know what else to call it. In front of me, I could see a type of marketplace, but I'd say it was from hundreds of years ago. It was raining heavily. There were people around me dressed in clothes from hundreds of years ago, and there were cobblestones on the ground. The people seemed totally unaware of me. They walked past me and through me, or so it seemed. They were dirty and unkempt, and then suddenly it was all gone. And I'm there, sat on the sofa, and I couldn't understand what the hell had just happened. Although it was very late, I called my boyfriend and I told him what I'd seen. He suggested it was a portal, and I may have been seeing a scene from that era or back then. That seemed logical. While sitting on the sofa watching TV one night at John's flat, I experienced something which scared me, Pearl said. In the cold corner of the living room there was a desk, and the telephone and various other things were on there. Something caught my attention, and I saw the pencil start to roll off the desk. It stopped at the edge, and then it fell to the floor. It stopped again, then it rolled towards me, maybe 2 or 3 feet, and then it stopped suddenly. I was on the sofa. John was in bed. There was nobody else there. Anyway, thank goodness, there were no more night shifts there after that, just a few day shifts. During those day shifts, I met John's brother, who had moved into the area to be able to visit every day. He complained that staff were buying and stealing light bulbs. Long story short, the bulbs didn't last more than a few days in the living room. He had the electrics checked by a professional electrician, and no fault could be found. So, Debs, these were my experiences in that mysterious flat. My boyfriend did some research to try and find out what had been on that land and what, if anything, had happened there, but he couldn't find anything. The paranormal experiences from my current job I will put in another email. I know so many other people have experienced these things that they cannot explain. But I also know every time a new person shares, it makes it so much easier for them. Pearl's experience really shook me up, right? I was confined to my bed for a long time after an accident that I had in 2006. It took me years to be able to regain the use of my right leg and arm. You have a lot of time to think when you're bedbound, and I use that time to hold my skills without even knowing. All those years passed by. The abilities that I had as a child that followed me with shame into adulthood, I'd shut them down and locked them away. Like Pearl, all of the taps in my home would turn on 2 a.m. in the morning, in the middle of the night. All things that I'd put at the side of me would be in other rooms, even though I couldn't even hold weight to stand up there. I had a cast on my leg and my arm. I made excuses for it, but after time, with only my brain for entertainment, I noticed an increase in the paranormal activity that was going on around me. I wonder if this is what's happened with John. We also don't know his past. He could have had paranormal experiences before that we don't know about. He might have been able to pick up on things or see things. I think I find the report so scary because I had to think about some incidents that I'd pushed to the back of my mind. And I know how traumatic it can be to be picked up and moved from your bed when you can't even move that far to brush your own hair, let alone walk. Like John being tucked to the end of his bed. One night, Mark found me trying to climb through the bedroom window, as if I was being carried. And to me, that's how it felt. And it felt like I was being cradled. But those arms that were cradling me had bad intent. If I'd have gone through that window in the state that I was in, I would have killed me. I don't really know if you attract paranormal activity, or is the things happening around you your kinesis, your technical, ability, whatever name you want to give it? Are we affecting energy around us and producing this activity? I don't know. It's just a question I ask myself. I'll leave you to ponder everything I've shared tonight as I bid you farewell. And remember to lock up tight. Good night, everyone.